Hello everyone, my name is Eve Hanlon, and in this video I'm going to show you how to divide dahlia tubers. So this video will basically have three parts. First I'm going to show you some of my favorite tools for dividing dahlia tubers. Then I'll go over, just real quick, the anatomy of a dahlia tuber, how to identify eyes, and how to make the right dividing cuts. And finally I'll go through three different examples of dividing dahlia tubers from start to finish, starting with an easy to divide dahlia tuber and moving up in difficulty. These are my favorite dahlia dividing tools. First, most important, the needle nose pruners. I love these because they're very thin. I think that if I had to choose only one weapon to divide dahlias with, these would be the most important. Next, I have these two tools which are used kind of for the same purpose, which is stabbing and splitting apart larger chunks of dahlias. The knife is good for difficult to reach cuts. When I can't cut something with the pruners, I can usually get to it with a knife. This is a Hori-hori. It's like a sharp gardening knife or shovel, and it's pretty thin, but not quite as thin as like the kitchen knife. This is nice for splitting apart really large chunks of dahlia tubers. Next, I have an old pair of scissors that I like to keep pretty sharp, and I use them to trim off the fibrous roots that kind of grow off the ends of the dahlia tubers that are, if we cut off those little fibrous roots on the dahlia tubers, they'll grow back next year as soon as they get planted in the ground. It's not necessary to cut them off, but it does make your dahlia tubers a lot neater. And finally, I have an old toothbrush and a Sharpie for cleaning off dahlia tubers and labeling them. This is my typical dahlia dividing setup. I like to have a small table elevated on some crates or even some cinder blocks so that it's a little bit higher up and easier to work on. And then I like to have a box or a bin of some sort right off the edge of the table so that as I'm dividing, I can quickly and easily push the extra dirt, the junk, right into the box. Ideally, your box will have handles, or your bin will have handles, so that it's pretty easy to empty out and into the compost. Now, before we move on to part 2 and talk about the anatomy of a dahlia tuber, I'm going to get this cleaned up a little bit so that it's easier to see. This dahlia had one stem last year, right here. This area right here at the base of the stem is called the collar. And this is the most important part of a dahlia tuber because this is where next year's eyes will come from. These are the tubers. This is one tuber right here. This tuber has a neck. The neck connects to the collar, and the collar connects to the stem. It's pretty difficult to identify eyes at this point because they're so small. But we're pretty lucky. You'll notice that these few right here, 1, 2, 3, are starting to swell up a little bit more, and they're easier to see. The eyes will swell closer to springtime, or when the dahlia tuber is exposed to more moisture. It takes a little bit of practice to identify an eye on a dahlia tuber, but you can kind of see they're always going to be in this collar area, the zone that connects to the stem. Sometimes they'll even be on the stem, and sometimes they'll just be these really small bumps. Like you see this one right here, it's pretty small. There's one right here, there's one right here, there's one right here, one right here. This is a healthy tuber. Something that's interesting is that dahlia tuber eyes can be different colors, but the color doesn't necessarily correspond with the color that the bloom is going to be. Some eyes will swell up more than others, and sometimes you'll get overachiever dahlia varieties, like this one right here. You'll notice that in this picture, the dahlia tuber eyes are actually sprouting up the stem. This kind of depends on the variety, and the best way to test and tell whether or not you have a chance of getting eyes on a dahlia tuber stem is to tap the stem and see if it's hollow or rotten. It's usually pretty clear. A stem that might grow eyes will have the same firmness to it that a dahlia tuber does. A healthy dahlia tuber will be heavy, firm, dense, and solid. While not ideal, if you have some ugly looking dahlia tubers that are cut or dented up or have little rodent chews in them, they will still grow as long as they're still kind of dense and firm. If your dahlia tubers are wrinkled a little bit, it's definitely not the end of the world. But once they start to really shrivel up like this and they become dry, then they're probably not going to grow. However, if you think that, maybe they don't look great, but there still might be a chance, then it's worth planting them or doing a pre-sprout test just to see if they grow. A dahlia tuber that has no hope will be dry and crunchy. The main goal of dividing dahlia tubers is to split off a tuber that connects to a part of the collar or even a part of the stem that has an eye attached to it. If you were to cut your dahlia tuber right here and just kept this part from here down, your dahlia tuber would not grow, unfortunately. You have to have a part of the collar with an eye attached to it. Now that we understand the anatomy of a dahlia tuber, we're going to start dividing. The first thing I'm going to do is trim the stem down, since the stem is clearly hollow and dead and is not going to grow any eyes. What makes this dahlia tuber pretty easy to divide is that it's relatively flat, and all of the tubers, as well as all of these nice clusters of the collar with eyes, all radiate off of the stem. I like to divide my dahlias so that instead of just having one tuber connected to one section of the collar with eyes, I like to have little clusters. The reason I do this is because I get multiple eyes and a few more tubers, gives a little bit more energy, and I get a bushier plant the first year. This is just my style, my personal preference. A lot of people will divide down so that they have at least one eye and one tuber, and that's enough to get one dahlia plant. For my first cut, I'm just going to try and split this dahlia clump right in half. I'm paying attention to the angle of this tuber underneath as I make this cut so that I don't slice through it. But it looks like these two halves will separate neatly. Now that things are in half, it'll be a little bit easier to decide how to break this up. So I've got 7 actually, tubers right here. And I've got a bunch of eyes over here and a bunch of eyes over here. What I want to do is create a cluster of 3 and a cluster of 4. So I'm going to cut right here. So these are 2 tubers, or tuber clusters, that I would sell or plant in my garden. Technically, you could divide this one further. You could split this in half, because there's an eye right down there and a couple of eyes over here. So these 2 tubers could be connected to that eye, and these 2 tubers could be connected to these eyes. But I'm not going to break it down any farther than that, because I have a feeling when I try to make this cut, I'm going to hurt that eye in there. I'd rather have a larger clump or sell a larger clump than damage eyes unnecessarily. But that's just my personal preference. Now let's divide the other half. When you have tubers like this that are only sort of attached, you can kind of decide whether you want to let them be and see if they're, if they're still connected, there's still a chance that your dahlia could still, get energy from this. But the reality is that this one is so close to breaking off that I'm just going to cut it. So this is interesting. We've got kind of 2 sides. If you rotate the dahlia tuber and you look, we've got a bunch of eyes coming up underneath over here that kind of connect to these 2 tubers. And then if you flip it over, then these tubers over here all kind of connect to parts of the collar on this side. I'm going to trim right here and try and split them apart like so. So now, as you can see, we've got 3 dahlia tubers here, 2 dahlia tubers here, we've got eyes over here and eyes over here, so this is pretty easy to split right down the center. There we go. We have 2 more beautiful, sellable, or plantable clusters. Since dahlia tubers basically all look the same during wintertime and there's no way to identify which variety is which, labeling and organization is very important. That's why I like to use a toothbrush to kind of clear away a little bit of the dirt, and then a Sharpie to mark the tuber. I like to use letter codes. This is Lollipop, a really tall red ball type dahlia. Clearing the tuber with a toothbrush just makes it easier to write on. Uses less Sharpie ink also. Finally, I'll store my dahlia tubers in some sort of labeled bag or box to keep them organized. Now let's move on to a dahlia tuber that's a little bit more difficult. This dahlia tuber is more challenging because it has many layers, it's got really big tubers, it's kind of hard to decide how to approach dividing this dahlia tuber. So the first thing you'll do is clean off the dahlia tuber. I like to use the tips of the needle nose pruners. Now it's a little bit easier to see the dahlia tuber. If we move it around and try and see what's loose, you notice that this piece right here almost naturally wants to separate off from the rest. And a good rule of thumb is to consider that each stem will have its own collar and then its own tubers connected to it. But a lot of times the tubers themselves will kind of grow together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut right there. Separate this cluster off. Now this cluster is a little bit more difficult. It looks like this stem right here is connected to a cluster that grew underneath the cluster right here that this stem is connected to. So I'm going to see if they'll kind of break apart. It's not looking like it, so I'm going to get the knife and I'm going to split it apart right in this area where they seem to be connected. So this big tuber right here, I'm not worried about the fact that it's damaged. This is one that I wouldn't sell because I don't want to concern anybody, but I'll definitely plant it because it's a big, healthy tuber, even though it's a little bit blemished. Now I'm going to trim the stem down, and I'm going to split across areas that are connected to the collar. Whoops. Well, I broke this one off, but luckily it has a bunch of eyes on it. This one just fell off, but unfortunately it does not have any section of the collar or any eyes connected to it. This one broke off too, but it does have a section of the collar and the eyes. And finally, we've got this piece right here. This wants to separate off naturally. And I'm going to call this good. It's a pretty big cluster, but it's fine with me. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plantable tubers from this one plant. This last Dahlia tuber cluster looks a bit different for a couple of reasons. Number 1, it is a different variety. And number 2, this Dahlia tuber was washed off in the fall. I'll talk about my Dahlia storage method and other Dahlia storage method options in another video soon. The first thing I want to do is trim the roots off. Next, I'm going to trim the stems a little bit shorter. Now I'm going to see if any of these tuber clusters want to split off naturally with just a little bit of convincing. You'll notice that as I'm kind of breaking these two apart, there's a tuber right in here that's going to split down the middle if I go any further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide who gets the tuber, and then I'm going to cut so that it doesn't tear anymore. Also, it's good at this point to do a little bit of untangling. Now we have 2 halves that are going to be a little bit easier to divide. Same thing here with a splitting tuber. It'll be all right. Now this tuber cluster is a little bit bigger. I'm going to cut the stem shorter, and then I'm going to use the stem to start splitting. And now's a good time to carefully use this knife to kind of split this tuber cluster in half. So now that I have the knife in there, I'm going to twist. You hear that little pop? Separate the tubers. Now I have a lot of smaller Dahlia tuber clusters that are going to be much easier to divide. And that's it. Now we just need to label these Dahlia tubers and put them away. If you have any additional Dahlia growing questions or Dahlia dividing questions or even any video requests, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.